Welcome to the University of the West Indies, the Department of Literature and English Cape Lecture Series for 2021. This is the first time that the department will be offering the Literatures in English Cape Lecture Series online. One of the advantages of that is that you will be able to access the lectures at your own convenience after they have been posted. But one of the disadvantages is that you will not have that direct and immediate interaction with the presenter that you would have in a face-to-face situation. So I encourage you to post your questions in the chat. The presenter will be able to see these questions and will respond to them at the end of the presentation. Another disadvantage of the online mode of delivery is that sometimes it can be pretty easy to be distracted in the online classroom. I suggest that you use note-taking as a way of remaining focused. Have your notebook next to you and write notes. Sure. I expect that many of you intend to continue your studies at university after you've completed your CAPE exams. And I hope that most of you have already applied to the University of the West Indies. Be sure to go on to the Literatures in English website to look at the programs we offer to see if any of them are a fit for you. In addition to our long-standing BA Literatures in English, we also offer a BA in Liberal Studies, a BA in Film Studies, and most recently, a BA in Writing, Literature, and Publishing. If you have any questions or queries, you can contact us using the contact information given on the website. You can easily access the website through the UWI Mona homepage. Click on faculties and then click on the name of the department. We'd be happy to hear from you. I hope you enjoy our CAPE lecture series, and I hope that you find it instructive and useful as you prepare for your CAPE Literatures in English exams. Good luck in your exams, and I hope to see you at UWI Mona, and especially in the Department of Literatures in English. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third in the CAPE Literatures in English CAPE seminars. Yesterday, you have heard, if you were here, you would have heard from Dr. Aisha Spencer, who did a presentation on how to respond to exam questions. As a consequence, although I had a prepared presentation on poems with an argument setup, what I'm intending to do is to show you how, taking a formal question from a past paper, how can you mobilize what you know? And part of preparing for the CAPE Literatures in English seminar requires that you demonstrate what you know. Part of what we want to do is to demonstrate what you know. And so it's important for you to pay particular attention to how can I mobilize what I know. You should first understand what are the kinds of knowledge that the examination will reward. And clearly, knowledge of the poems. You should know the poems well that are set on the syllabus, but also the craft of poetry, knowledge of the literary devices that you will see in poetry. And you should also be aware of extra textual information about the author's biography, the author's historical context, and a number of other kinds of things, for example, critical responses, theoretical responses to the study of poetry. And these are the kinds of knowledge. And some of these I'm going to demonstrate in this discussion I'm going to have on Wilfred Owen's poetry. I also want to point out that how you organize the material that you know is going to be important. So first and foremost, you will take a question, you will focus on the question, and in focusing on the question, you will determine how can I use the knowledge I have to answer this question? What is the question asking me about? And we're going to focus a little bit on a question that I want to present to you and to show you how you could mobilize knowledge of three poems in an argument as a response to that question. So in a previous examination, the question was, in Wilfred Owen's collection of poetry, his preoccupation with war restricts his manipulation of poetic techniques. And one general comment I would make about the kinds of questions you will see, it goes on to say, with reference to at least three poems by one British, American, or post-colonial poet you have studied, discuss the validity of this statement. It is clear to me that the questions have to be kind of general in order to be applied to each of the different poets on the syllabus. And if you've chosen Wilfred Owen, you know clearly that that's a British poet, and that's the one that you're going to use. Three poems by this British poet, Wilfred Owen. But the question is, his preoccupation with war restricts his manipulation of poetic techniques. One of the things you must remember as you face these exam questions, not all the statements that are presented to you, you're expected to say yes to. In fact, there is no determination of how you should respond. The examiners are interested in how you mobilize what you know in response to a prompt. And clearly, this would be a problematic thing to say his preoccupation with war restricts. If you agree with that, it's going to be a harder question to answer. I think it's a better way for you to demonstrate the knowledge that you have by saying, no, his preoccupation with war does not restrict his manipulation of poetic techniques. In fact, I would argue that his ability to manipulate poetic techniques allows him to explore the theme and the questions and the issues around war. And so what I want to do today is to talk about, and I've used a line from Wilfred Owen poem, vain citadels that are not walled, institutional rhetoric, memorable poetry, and the bloody material body in war. And already you can see that I want to talk about rhetoric. I want to talk about memorable poetry in a way to talk about the manipulation of poetic techniques. And the bloody material body suggests that I want to talk about a graphic imagery of the body in these poems in his discussion of war. There is no doubt the named war poet Wilfred Owen is preoccupied with the subject of war. And that's the first thing I would just declare. We know that he's preoccupied. We are agreeing with that part of the question. However, I would argue that Owen's poetry mobilizes his poetic resources to expose the ironic contrast between the rhetoric of social institutions and the horrors of everyday combat. As a consequence, irony, contrast, and a poetics of revelation are poetic strategies that mark these poems. In this way, Owen is able to expose the high rhetoric of institutions as a linguistic trick, where the power of language, through words or symbolism to inspire duty, is exposed as a manipulation. The appeal to lofty ideals mask the harsh realities of war. In fact, Owen suggests that the very attempt to make language a source of inspiration is the way in which the truth of war is hidden. And these high-sounding words are in fact like vain citadels that are not walled. And perhaps you might want to ask me, what is a citadel? A citadel is defined as a fortress, typically on high ground, often a strong castle in or near a city where people can shelter from danger, especially during war. These high sounding words or ideas offer no protection or shelter for these young soldiers, right? And that's why it's described as a vain citadel, neither for their bodies or their minds. In poems such as Dulce et Decorum Est, The Send Off, and Exposure, Wilfred Owen shows that the righteous rhetoric coming from institutions such as the nation, the family, or the church provide no proper justification for the mental and physical trauma of war. Now, listen to this sentence I'm about to present. Via graphic imagery, rhetorical questions, terms of negation, lofty diction, irony, and a poetics of revelation, for example, Owen shows that poetic devices are central to challenging the sources of authority that mobilizes our efforts to engage in war. Indeed, exploring war and its horrors relies on Owen's manipulation of poetic devices. Now, notice that this is an extended introduction. In the past, I've noticed that CAPE students, when I used to be the chief examiner, would just give you 2 sentences as an introduction. They would repeat the question and they would write something approximating to a thesis statement. You need to set the context for your discussion. You need to define any terms that you think that are important. You need to indicate which poems you're going to use, and you need that thesis statement. So be careful that you're constructing a proper introduction to your discussion. The other thing I want to say is to pay attention to how you use the first sentence of a paragraph. Ensure that that first sentence of a paragraph links with the question and links with your thesis statement, the argument that you're making. So I go on to the second paragraph. Mobilizing diction, Owen focuses on the word decorum in the title. And this word returns in the last lines of the poem. And his focus on the word decorum perhaps is the first word that shows us an example of the trick of language that is used to exploit the innocence of the young. Decorum speaks to appropriate behavior, and it is an appeal to youngsters to desire good behavior, which will be approved of by the authorities. In a letter of October 1917, Owen wrote to his mother, indicating why he included some, quote, Latin words. And I'm quoting from the letter now. Quote, here is a gas poem done yesterday, which is not private, but not final. The famous Latin tag means, of course, quote, it is sweet and meet to die for one's country. Sweet, exclamation sign, and decorous, exclamation sign. In Owen's translation of the word, he emphasizes the beauty of the words because the words also carry a strong appeal by retaining the Latin words. Owen draws attention to language and then contrasts those beautiful words with the ugliness of war. Now, you will notice in that second paragraph that I have demonstrated knowledge of the poet's biography. I have referred to a letter he has written to his mother, a letter that is speaking to specifically the term, the Latin terms used in this poem. Here is a way that you can just incorporate things that you know about the poet's biography. The third paragraph. The ideas of sweetness and appropriateness and what constitutes decorum in war mobilization are questioned by Owen by his attention to sweet-sounding diction, which he contrasts with the sour experience of war. Right? You could make that even simpler by saying Owen's attention to sweet-sounding diction is contrasted with the sour experience of war. Or he mobilizes sweet-sounding diction and contrasts those with the sour experience of war. In that, you're making a connection back to the idea that he mobilizes literary devices even as he talks about war. And therefore, that topic sentence is connecting you to your question and to your thesis. As Mark D. Sear argues, quote, the terms high zest, ardent, and desperate glory, and these are quotes from the poem, ring with echoes of heroism. Yet each high diction phrase has been countered by the low descriptions given earlier in the poem. Historical records show there was a host of literature, and this I'm going on to, this is my view now, I've stopped quoting from the critic. Historical records show there was a host of literature that mobilized such beautiful words to recruit soldiers. For example, Helen Cross reports that the poem was initially ironically dedicated to Jessie Pope, quote, who was responsible for many enthusiastic patriotic verses, unquote. The title of one of her books, Simple Rhymes for Stirring Times, gives an idea of the tone of her work. In The Call, for example, she contrasts the laddie who is going out to win with a coward who would rather save his skin. So we have going out to win with a coward who would rather save his skin, unquote. Note the rhyme used creating sound harmony that is mobilized to get people to participate in the war effort. Here, at the beginning of this paragraph, I have made a reference to a critic who has made a comment on this poem. I've also made, I'm giving you historical information to say that the poem was initially dedicated to someone who would write beautiful words to stimulate people to join the war effort. Here again, I'm taking the opportunity to demonstrate knowledge that I have that will be credited. Note the rhyme used in this woman's poetry, creating sound harmony that is used to mobilize people. As Lawrence Binion's poetry of 1914 does a similar job in describing in sweet words the enthusiasm and good cheer of the soldiers. Quote, they went with songs to the battle, they were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. To a certain extent, unquote, to a certain extent, Owen interrogates such elevated language, both with the poem, both in the poem by including the Latin words, and external to the poem through his ironic dedication, thereby questioning a whole tradition of war poetry. Irony and diction are manipulated by Owen to explore the deceptions of the authority in the war effort. I now move in greater detail to now demonstrate my knowledge of literary techniques by going into a kind of close reading of how he does this contrast of these graphic images of the horrors of war compared to the beautiful words of dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is good and honorable to die for one's country. Next paragraph. His use of graphic images in a series of comparisons exposes the damage and impairment of the body of the soldiers, and that leads to seriously questioning the value of war as touted in strategies of recruitment. A series of comparisons about damaged posture, quote, bent like old beggars under sacks, unquote, quote, knock-kneed, unquote, and the damage to the body, quote, coughing like hags, unquote, is used to register the impact on the soldier. One of the weapons of war was chemical in nature. According to Helen Cross, quote, mustard gas, one of the first forms of chemical warfare, was introduced in 1950. It burns the membranes of the throat and lungs. Many soldiers were poisoned and died an agonizing death. So notice I'm connecting something in the poem by focusing on the imagery of damage to the body to information that I have outside of the poem that connects with what Owen is doing. This is how you are mobilizing, incorporating both your internal knowledge as well as your external knowledge. I go on. The images of bruising of the body in the word bloodshot, quote unquote, in line 6, which anticipates, quote, The blood come gargling from froth-corrupted lungs, quote unquote, of line 23. Now adds images of disease, images of bruising. Now, so we began with the damage, the shift in posture, damage to the body, images of bruising, and now images of disease with reference to, quote, obscene cancer and, quote, incurable sores. Images of impaired movement, suggested by the slow and heavy movement in words such as trudge, line 4, lame, line 6, and limped, line 6. And even the short sentence, men marched asleep, which suggests sleepwalking, all connote damage to the bodies of these previously agile young men. Graphic imagery is used to expose the horrors of war and the irony of the title of the poem. Now, I want to point something else. Not only has this paragraph engaged with different aspects of imagery, and remember, you don't need to go to the classic, you don't need to restrict yourself, perhaps is a better way of saying this, to the classic idea that you have visual, auditory, olfactory, kinesthetic imagery. There are other ways of talking about imagery, right? Images of damaged bodies, I'm suggesting. I'm describing the kind of imagery, classifying the kind of imagery. And that's one of the strategies that you can do. As you read these poems and you see patterns of meaning, patterns of strategy, you can link them together. And in this paragraph, I've discussed that. The other thing that is important for you to pay attention to is notice how I use the last sentence in a paragraph. The last sentence in a paragraph is to remind your reader, the examiner, that you know that you're on topic. The question is his preoccupation with war restricting his use of poetic technique? Listen to the last sentence in this paragraph. Graphic imagery is used to expose the horrors of war and the irony of the title of the poem. You come back, you clinch the idea. That is why the last sentence in a paragraph is referred to as the clincher sentence. I now want to make a transition to a new point. And so you must be able to mobilize in your topic sentences transitional words, words that help you to connect with what you said before, so that you represent your essay, and notice I'm losing my voice, as a seamless whole. The next paragraph, I use a transitional phrase. There's also the excellent use of rhyme, fumbling, stumbling, drowning, floundering, stanza 2, to connect through sound the idea of disarray and confusion, alerting us to the mental, emotional, psychological damage of war. So here you see that I am shifting now from the physical damage only, which is what those graphic images, impaired movement, the damage to the body, the diseased body, the imagery associated with that of the previous paragraph, to now talk about rhyme and how rhyme takes us beyond the physical into the mental, the emotional, and psychological. In this way, you're giving depth to your argument, right? And perhaps you might even want to go back to your introduction and to say, if you were revising this essay, perhaps I should talk about not just the questioning of beautiful words, but how ways in which this poet focuses on the physical, but also psychological damage that come as a consequence of war. Anyway, let's go back to the introductory sentence here. There's also the excellent use of rhyme. To connect through sound, the idea of disarray and confusion, alerting us to the mental, emotional, and psychological damage of war. In this regard, sorry about that. In this regard, these kinesthetic images of impaired movement are also linked now with impaired mental awareness. Definitions of these words illustrate this point. For example, while fumbling, which means awkward or clumsy movement, stumbling means both tripping or losing balance while walking, moving with difficulty, but also making repeated mistakes, especially in speech. Um, I gather you're not seeing the slides, but there's not much regarding the slides for this morning. I've only put up one thing and I'm not shifting the slides quite yet. So don't worry about that. I will come back to focusing on the central ideas. So here, while fumbling means awkward or clumsy movement, stumbling means both tripping or losing balance while walking, moving with difficulty, but also making repeated mistakes, especially in speech. So there is the stumbling is also a linguistic stumbling, almost as if you can't speak properly. Also, floundering means to struggle or stagger clumsily in mud or water, but also to struggle mentally, showing to show or feel great confusion. So here I am suggesting that the images around movement, kinesthetic images of movement, of impaired movement, is a way in which, through the word like floundering or stumbling, suggests that the impairment is not just physical, it is linguistic, and secondly, it is mental. Floundering also means to struggle mentally or to show great confusion. The impairment of the senses is suggested by words such as blind, deaf, drunk, tired, indicating the compromised ability to see, to hear, to be alert, and to metonymically um, uh, linked to impairment through consumption of alcohol or through fatigue. So there is the idea that through consumption of alcohol suggested to the word drunk. So the word drunk is closely associated with people who consume alcohol. And that's why it's metonymic. Metonymy is a word or a literary device that talks about something that's closely related to something else that stands in place for it. So when we see the word drunk, we think of people consuming alcohol. And metonymically, it is suggesting a kind of impaired state because that's one of the effects of alcohol. Or if you're tired, that's when you lose focus. If you're driving a car and you get tired, you're going to lose your focus, you're going to fall asleep, and you're not as alert. So the impairment of the body is now linked in this paragraph to the impairment of the senses. Later in the next stanza, these words connect with guttering, choking, plunging, smothering. These are all words suggesting struggle to breathe and the struggle to stay upright in a context when the gas is like a man struggling underwater. Right? The gas is like a man struggling underwater. The last image I showed was this definition of citadel, and this new image is an image taken from the War Museum in Australia of the gas mask that is used. This becomes a central image in the poem. Later, as I went on to say that the words guttering, choking, plunging, smothering are all associated with the struggle to breathe. The significance of the drowning image with the wearing of the gas mask suggests that if you don't wear the drowning image is both a sense of you're without your mask struggling to breathe when the gas hits you, but also the gas mask also gives you a kind of underwater image as well. So there's a double kind of referencing of a kind of drowning possibility here. The significance of the drowning image with the wearing of the gas mask suggests that something as normal as breathing is jeopardized in battle. According to Helen Cross, quote, the gas masks had celluloid windows, as you can see from the image put up, giving the effect of being underwater, like a deep sea diver, unquote. Owen manipulates rhyming words that are also using the present continuous tense to reinforce the seeming never-ending horror of war. To explore war is not at the expense of its manipulation of poetic technique. And notice how I finished that paragraph. Coming back, going back to the argument, here I'm demonstrating he's using poetic techniques, he's exploring war, and therefore I'm resisting the suggestion given by this question. In this poem, the poet also mobilizes a poetics of vision to suggest that the vision offered of patriotism from war is different from the vision painted by the nationalistic recruitment machine. The line, quote, dim through the misty panes and thick green light. So of course, the misty panes, you're looking through the gas mask, and this is a reference to that. Describes the vision seen from the gas mask. This is where I'm introducing that the central image of looking through the gas mask becomes a larger point being made by Owen about seeing, about how it is that it's only on the battlefield that people come to see graphically the horrors of war. The pretty words that are said by the nationalist in Dulce et Decorum Est, by the family in the second poem I mentioned, and by religion in the third poem, are all being questioned. And he uses this poetics of revelation, of vision and of revelation, that you come to an awareness in the moment of war. Owen manipulates irony to show that there's a better vision of reality of war from the gas mask than the vision of heroism celebrated in the war rhetoric like it is good and honorable to die for one's country, right? It's an irony that is when your eyes are covered and you're looking through a lens that is foggy and like you're underwater that you come to realize the truth. And so this poetics of vision becomes an important part of what he's doing. When the soldier finally sees or experiences the horrors of war, the poet describes the vision ironically as, quote, helpless sight. It is sight that can't help you now. You should have seen this prior to war. And therefore, part of the power of his poetry and part of the mobilization of his poetry is for people to come to see. And this poetics of revelation that he engages is very important. He ironically uses the phrase helpless sight because it is already too late. In the end, the poet invites all those who hang on the high sounding words to come witness the horrors of war. If you should come, he says in one of his poems, and look at this, then you will not say. Right? The images of death in words such as smother, writhing, hanging, alongside with the paradoxes and ecstasy of fumbling. Ecstasy is associated with something pleasant, but fumbling suggests struggle, right? Like a devil sick of sin, right? Could a devil be sick of sin? That is how horrifying it is that even somebody who loves sin would become sick of it. Kind of exaggerated paradox. The death images and the paradoxes finally offer us the ultimate indictment on the practice of using beautiful, speaking lofty words to lure the young and the innocent. For Owen, the poetic techniques are absolutely essential to magnify his views on war. Notice I come back again. I'm going back to the question. I am linking, I'm showing how my argument is part of demonstrating my response to the question. I don't have too much time left. I want to quickly say a few things about the send-off, and which is the second poem, which is the family giving encouragement to the boys to go to war. I'll take perhaps an extra 5 minutes and finish at 10:50, and then to introduce a few things about the others that you can see how it might be mobilized in response to this question. The poem, The Send-Off, Owen mobilizes contrast again to show how the flowers of encouragement, and notice I'm using a metaphor now, because flowers are given and becomes a central motif of this poem. The flowers of encouragement and celebration do not prepare them for the suffering and death in war. Even if you don't trust the officials of government, you are more likely to trust your family. That's reasonable. The people who love you, your ma and your pa. However, paradox and irony are deployed to significant effect to expose the trick of familial support for war as ill-advised. Young men in a family would represent a family's contribution to that war. For fathers, these young men would display valor, patriotism, manliness. Yet a series of contrasts through poetic structure, irony, and paradox expose these sentiments as death wishes for the youngsters. For example, the singing of the first line of the poem can be contrasted with the silence of the last line. And through sound, again, those words are connected. They, the, the two words begin with S, S-I, singing and silence. And singing is about something that you verbalize, that makes a sound, and silence is without sound. And so this contrast between the liveliness of sounds in singing is then contrasted with the silence at the end. Down the closed, darkening lanes, they sang their way. But you know, the poet is already suggesting something negative and ironic about singing being associated with darkening lanes. And the word down suggests a declension, a movement downward rather than upward. And in a way, if you do a close reading of this line, he's already suggested that the singing is accompanied with darkness from the very beginning. And there is the irony that is being mobilized. Down the close, darkening lanes, they sang their way to the siding shed. And the last may creep back silent to village wells up half-known roads. Notice the use of caesura in the penultimate line, pausing, may creep back, comma, silent, comma, to village wells, break of line, up half-known roads. All these are pauses being set by the poet, deliberately for us to pay attention. There's a comma before and after the word silent, setting it apart for focus and emphasis. Yet the set of paradoxical situations through the poem help to reinforce this point of the darkness of war. So the suggestion of soldiers singing down darkening lanes is one example of paradox. Darkness does not normally symbolize something to sing about. Darkness often triggers fear and anxiety, not celebration as suggested in singing. In fact, ironically, singing might be the way that these soldiers try to dispel or mask their usual fear and anxiety about something as fearsome as putting one's life at risk. Other paradoxes, such as faces grimly gay and the white flowers described as both a corsage and a wreath. These paradoxes are also underlined with irony. The light image is a winking lamp, suggesting lights on and off, not steady light. And usually light is associated with life, and it suggests a wavering life, a life that is at risk of being put out. And if light is a symbol of light, it suggests that this travel to the battlefield was one which suggests that the travel to the battlefield was one in which there is unsteady light would not guarantee a celebration of life. It's therefore an ironic play on the image of light. I only have 3 minutes before I ask questions. I would have gone on to talk about winking as a kind of image of conspiracy and secrecy. And of course, how the poem ends by suggesting that the idea of trickery, that the beautiful language, the encouragement of the family was a kind of trickery, and the winking notion links with this idea of deception. The last poem, In Exposure, the title alluding to the Owen's Poetics of Revelation, and I'm taking the title Exposure as linking to this idea of vision or revelation. Exposure is to shed light on something. So light, vision, and revelation are 3 motifs that I think that in these 3 poems that you could connect to Owen's sense of this revelation, this coming to see what the truth is. In Exposure, the title alluding to Owen's Poetics of Revelation, he shows the psychological trauma of men trapped in uncomfortable positions as they await their deaths or further battle. They seem to lose hope in religion. The quote from line 35, "For love of God seems dying," And this is the poem I'm situating as something that they had come with religious encouragement, that churches and in terms of religious belief had been mobilized as well in support of war. And here, dying on the battlefield, they are losing focus in that. So both the nation, the family, and in this poem I'm suggesting, religion seem not to have supported them eventually. As Frost says, the terrible tension of being trapped in a state of enforced inactivity, exposed to the elements, there's another way in which you can read exposure, and simultaneously to constant uncertainty and fear of possible attack and sudden death is powerfully evoked in exposure. If dulce et decorum est pro patria mori was about physical damage, this poem details psychological impairment. There are images of illness with reference to the phrase brains ache in line 1, which on one level is suggestive of physical pain. A headache is a sure sign that something is wrong with an individual, but the writer chooses brains and not heads, as if to suggest that their mental capacity was being stretched to the point of aching, but also suggested impairment to the psyche. Worry is one source of mental and psychological strain, and the word is chosen deliberately. Notice the soldiers are both worried and wearied by silence. This waiting creates anxiety, worry, but also takes away their will to go on, wearied by silence. One of the great tools of a horror movie is silence. Just before something frightful happens, there's usually an ominous silence which unnerves us and creates anxiety. So even this motif of silence, the reference to silence, is a motif associated with anxiety. Yet there are images of sensory accounts that might even suggest the soldiers are hallucinating, mixing up the time and space dimension. In line 8 and 9, the persona describes the rumble of sounds as a rumor, not quite the reality that they're facing. And again, the word rumor, which suggests a different account from reality or something made up, is a thing that is a word, a motif that we can use as part of deception. We talk about winking light in the previous poem. We could now talk about rumor as a kind of main motive, suggesting deception. We're not getting the truth. Rumor is a word linked to speech and alerts us to wondering if the high-sounding words that lead men to war are in fact rumors, not quite true of the actual experience they see that they have. And of course, the rhetorical question in this poem, is it that we are dying, is a very important one. I'm going to stop there because the time is going and perhaps you have a few questions. But what I wanted to also indicate some general things to keep in mind. I have focused to a large extent on irony, contrast, diction, although it's not listed here, graphic imagery, and I've described the imagery in different kinds of ways, rhetorical questions, and of course, I've made this big notion about the poetics of revelation that's connected with words associated with vision, words associated with light, and words that talk about knowledge. In these three ways, we come to see that Wilfred Owen manipulates poetic techniques even as he explores. And in this case, you could say lots of other things that he explores, but to a large extent, I have focused primarily on his critique of a kind of high-sounding words that give you the lie that it is good and pleasant to go and serve in war when in fact it is not. His campaign against war is demonstrated in this poetics of revelation. I want to just bring to your attention some of the things that I've said incidentally, that there are different kinds of knowledge that you will bring to a poem, like to your question. Knowledge of the vocabulary of poems, the literary devices. You ought to know that what the words mean. And then you need to spend time. The more time you spend looking at how words, the meaning of words, is a way in which you can read poetry on various levels. So that's important. Knowledge of the poet's craft, that's going to be credited. Your knowledge of literary devices, how you deploy them, how you discuss them, how you explain them. Knowledge of the poet's life, biography, autobiographies, knowledge of the poet's context, history and sociology, a knowledge of critical heritage and critical approaches. These are things that are definitely going to be credited um, in the exam. All right, I'm going to stop sharing so I can pay attention to some questions, even as I try to plug in my computer. So let's see if there are any questions that I need to answer. Yes, I see somebody talking about winking and secrecy connected to the Morse code. I mean, that clearly is something that you could make a connection to. I didn't necessarily link it with that because of the argument that I'm presenting. But this is the kind of way in which you can bring extra textual, and part of it is how do you make the argument? Somebody's asking, how do you incorporate external information, such as the example you gave with Jesse Pope, and include criticism without making a long-winded paragraph? Yeah, you can. Many of you, one of the things I wanted to say is that many of you are not going to remember verbatim these quotes. So what you can do is to summarize. And in the summary, that's the way in which you can incorporate. For example, Jesse Pope in so-and-so, you should at least know where the source is. Suggest, and you make the claim that they suggest, and you summarize it and move on. But that's a way to incorporate it. This is almost like something that I'm going to, I'm going to make it a printed essay. And therefore, it is, you have less time, but you should take opportunities that are presented. And what I was trying to do is to show you how you incorporate knowledge, things that you know, information about the gas mask, when it was introduced, how it worked, you know, those kinds of things are important as well. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions. And let's see, I think our time in is, we have just 4 minutes. So unless there's one more or two more quick questions, those are the points I'd like to make. It's very difficult to deal with make this presentation because I can't see anybody. I don't know who's out there and who's listening. But external information, the question is, just to be clear, becomes critical information. External information can be various things. It could be biography. In this presentation, I made reference to a letter he wrote to his mother that was significant to my discussion. So that's external to the poem. That's what you call extrinsic information. And that's a kind of knowledge that you can use. But I also brought in critical statements, comments made by several critics throughout the presentation. Somebody who makes a comment about the poem, and you can agree with that statement and give further illustration of it, or you can critique it and say you have a different view from that. But that's another way of mobilizing critical information. And I also give that kind of historical context, things about war that are brought into that. So those are ways in which you can use it. I'm going to write in the chat the title of the book from which the statements, some of those statements came from various critics. As I said, Chanel, Lennon, that what you can do is to summarize the ideas from the external quotes. Where it comes to the poem, I think you must know some phrases, some words that connote imagery and so on. Those things you should study and know and can use, right? You can pull them out at various points. But where it comes to having these long quotes from critics, you might not be able to do so. Oxford student, let me put it a different way. Wilfred Owen selected poems and letters. And this is written by the editor, sorry, this is written by, edited by Helen Cross. Um, and there's a whole set of articles on Wilfred Owen because he's an established poet that has been around, and lots of them are available through Google and so on. And I don't know, I'll speak with my head of department to see if there's a way that people might be able to access some material if they want. Okay. I think this brings us to the end of this session. I hope it was useful to some of you, and I wish you all the best in your examination in the next few weeks. All the best. And I hope to see some of you at the University of the West Indies if you choose to continue this wonderful engagement with literature. Bye.